Hi, this is Michael Pepe from Saxe, Doernberger, and Vita. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about insuring loss of rental income. But first, I want to introduce my guest, Chris Mortifoglio from Procore Solutions and Consulting. Chris, thanks for being here today. Why don't you introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Michael. As Michael just said, my name is Chris Mortifoglio. I am a senior vice president and the director of forensic accounting at a firm by the name of Procore Solutions and Consulting. And we assist policyholders in their claim preparation, whether it's a complex property loss or a business interruption loss, or in this case, a loss of rents. We typically get involved in working with insureds during their insurance recovery process.
Well, thanks, Chris. And you and I have worked together on a number of occasions for some of our real estate clients. We've had loss of rent issues both during and outside of construction. So happy to have you here. What we're going to talk about today is generally what is rental value insurance or loss of rent insurance. We're going to talk about where you can look for that coverage. Then we're going to talk about some of the coverage triggers. And then Chris is going to do a deeper dive into how we calculate those loss of rents in different situations and some of the things to look out for. And we'll also talk about some of the coverage challenges and leave you with a couple concrete takeaways.
So let me go ahead and start things off, Michael. Let me ask this general question. What is rental value insurance?
Sure. Rental value insurance is time element property insurance. It pays for loss of rental income when a building that's rented when it's damaged by a covered cause of loss. So coverage is providable for the fair rental value of the portion of the premises that's occupied by the insured. And rental value insurance is also provided for those businesses or that business income that's generated from the other parts of the building that the owner may be renting or leasing out to others.
That's a great intro. And can you tell us a little bit about where this type of coverage might exist? What type of policies, what type of claims, where does this coverage show up?
Yeah, generally, you're going to see this on a first party policy. So the most common place is a first party commercial property policy, which most businesses have. It's going to show up either as business interruption, business income, or sometimes specifically called rental income or loss of rents. But we also see it on builder's risk policies, which is essentially a first party policy during construction. And there it may be called delay in completion coverage, where the loss of rents would be a part of that, or it could be, again, called out as loss of rents, loss of income. You can also see this on other policies. You can see it on pollution cleanup as business interruption. You could have cyber liability business interruption. It's an option on pretty much any first party policy that's covering your own losses, the insured's own losses. So, Chris, what are some of the types of claims that you get involved in where you see a loss of rent?
Sure. We typically see a wide range of impacts and types of losses, ranging from a single unit that has a pipe burst and there's some water damage to maybe something more common, which is there's a fire and it could impact one whole building or the entire apartment complex, to events that have a much larger impact, such as a catastrophe, a hurricane, or more recently this year, the winter storm in Texas in February that has caused significant damage to a number of our clients and quite a few apartment owners. So anything that results in physical damage are typically the type of claims that we see.
Yeah, the key thing there is all of those things that you mentioned, earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, they cause some type of physical damage. Generally speaking, the business interruption or loss of rents insurance is not going to stand on its own. It's a coverage that's available when the main coverage of the policy is triggered. And that's usually going to be triggered by physical loss or damage to tangible property. There could be some nuances as to what constitutes a physical loss or what constitutes physical damage. But in general, you have to establish that first and establish some coverage under the main policy before being able to access the loss of rents coverage. So when we're talking about loss of rents, what types of things are covered? When you go in to do an analysis and you have a client who suffered some kind of loss, what is it that you're looking for? What are the types of things that are going to be covered under that coverage part?
Sure. Michael, let me start off by just giving the general concepts behind business interruption insurance or loss of rents insurance. And that is essentially to put a policyholder in the same financial position that they would have been in, but for the loss. You'll hear that term, but for. That's an insurance term that we use in the industry. And it essentially just says, had this incident not occurred, whether it's a fire or a flood or an earthquake, how would your apartment building, how would your operations have performed had this not occurred? And the way we do that is we break down the performance of the business into multiple different areas. First, we're going to take a look at the expected or projected rental income or rents that you would have received. So let's talk about an example where you have a building that has 10 apartment units and it burns down and it's completely offline. Well, we would ask ourselves, how much rent would those 10 units have generated had this fire not happened? We'll compare that projection of rents to the actual rents that are collected while the building is damaged. And that difference is going to be our starting point to calculate your lost revenue. The other thing that policyholders always need to consider is while there's very clearly a loss of revenue, there's typically a corresponding set of saved expenses or non-continuing expenses. Think of things like supply costs. Think of things like cleaning costs or general maintenance costs. There's going to be a reduction in these expenses, and that reduction will offset your lost revenue. So that's the way insurance policies typically work, is they will look at your lost revenues. They'll reduce that by any saved expenses, again, to put you in the same financial position that the policyholder would have been in, but for the loss.
And that's a key provision there when you're saying, but for the loss. There may be other factors that are coming into play during that time period that are unrelated to the loss, unrelated to the fire, unrelated to the hurricane. There may be some other factors. If a new apartment building opens up right next door, you'd also want to analyze the impact of those other market effects or other causes that aren't a covered cause and subtract those out as well. Is that basically how you do it?
That's exactly right. And the point you just hit on is what makes each claim very unique. There's different sets of facts. There's different market factors. Every single claim is going to be unique in the way that you evaluate it. There's going to be some similarities, but you have to consider the specific facts and circumstances of that building or that operation that's been impacted.
Okay. Chris, what about the costs that you expend during that period of indemnity?
Yeah. So one of the other factors too that needs to be considered is any extra expenses. And these are typically just defined as extraordinary expenses incurred as a result of the loss. And they're usually incurred to help mitigate or reduce a business interruption loss or loss of rents. So one example of these types of costs are, let's go back to my scenario where we're talking about a building that burnt down. Well, as you get close to making those repairs and the apartment units are getting prepared to be brought back online and rented to prospective tenants, a lot of times our clients will want to start marketing these units. They'll spend money to advertise and let folks know that, hey, these units are coming online, because they're motivated to lease these up as quickly as possible. In general, oftentimes we'll see clients who will offer incentives or concessions to help to lease up their repaired units quicker than had they done nothing. So for example, maybe they're going to offer 1 month of free rent or a $500 gift card to incentivize prospective tenants. Again, the concept behind this is to spend some dollars to reduce your loss of rents and ultimately save everybody money.
Can extra expenses also go towards speeding up the repair, making the repair go faster to shorten the period of indemnity?
Yes, absolutely. And that's an analysis that we're often asked to perform, which is, hey, if we spend a little bit more money to speed up the repair timeline, what is the savings on the loss of rent? So if we spend $10,000 to reduce our repair timeline by a month, can we save at least 10,000, maybe 20,000, maybe 50,000? That's going to be a trade that everybody will always want to make, including the insurance company. So we're often asked to do that analysis, Michael.
So we've been talking about the period of indemnity or period of restoration. How do those work when we're talking about a property policy as opposed to a builder's risk or construction policy?
Yeah, this is a very important concept for folks to know. So the period of indemnity, it's also referred to as, you'll hear period of restoration, you'll hear loss period. They all mean the same thing. And it defines the period of time that a policyholder is able to collect loss of rents or business interruption proceeds on. It's typically defined as starting on the date of physical damage. So in the example we're using, the date the fire occurred, and it ends on essentially the date when repairs are completed or when they should have been completed with due diligence and dispatch. That helps to define the period of indemnity. And it's during this period that a policyholder is typically able to make a recovery for business interruption losses or loss of rents.
Right. And the language that defines the period of indemnity or period of restoration can be somewhat unique from policy to policy and carrier to carrier. So it's going to be important during that analysis to read that language carefully, determine when it starts, when it ends. Sometimes there's a deductible or waiting period at the beginning where you don't get coverage for a certain amount of time, or unless the loss exceeds a certain amount of time. But looking at that language and those definitions very carefully, it's going to define the period during which Chris is going to do those calculations that he talked about to look at the lost rental income, the saved expenses, and then the extra expenses that occur during that period.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. So we just spent some time talking about what these policies cover and what type of coverage is afforded. Just as importantly, it's always good to be aware of what is not covered or what is excluded. So do you want to spend a few minutes talking about that?
Sure. Yeah. One of the first things that policyholders need to understand is, like anything else that's covered by insurance, what is covered and what's not covered is going to be dictated by the specific language in your policy. So it's very unlikely the policy is not going to provide complete balance sheet protection for anything that happens as a result of a fire or any other covered cause of loss. You're going to look at what is covered under the policy. Now, typically, this is an all-risk policy, which means it is everything except which is excluded. So then we're going to go and look at the exclusions and see which things don't apply. One thing to always keep in mind, and I'm going to throw in my legal aspect here, is that the burden of proof shifts. It's the policyholder's burden to prove what's covered by the policy, but it is the carrier's burden, the insurer's burden, to prove that an exclusion applies. So that's important to always keep in mind when you're talking about exclusions on a policy. But one of the ones that we see come up a lot in loss of rent issues is the loss of market exclusion. So the loss of market exclusion is going to apply in situations where there's other factors that may play into the amount of loss that the insured is experiencing. So for example, if during the time that the repair is taking place, during the period of restoration, something changes in the market where rents are lower than they would have been, or there's other businesses or other available apartments in the area that change. The market gets flooded because a new building opens, so your value goes down. That's a loss of market in sort of its purest sense that isn't related to the covered cause of loss, the fire, the earthquake, the hurricane. What's become an interesting issue is when that loss of market happens as a result of the covered cause of loss, or it's the delay that's caused by the covered cause of loss that puts you into a market that you otherwise would not have been in. A good example of this is in academic rental markets, where because of a covered cause of loss, you would have been renting out at the prime season in July, and as a result, you can't rent units then, and now you're trying to fill those units in October or November, and it's going to be very difficult to rent those units then, just because of the nature of the location, the nature of the calendar. If the only reason you're having to rent that unit in October or November is due to the covered cause of loss, there's an argument to be made that the loss of market exclusion does not apply. But again, it's going to be very specific to the language in the policy, the jurisdiction, and how courts are viewing that language. We're starting to see some carriers put very specific language into their policies that appears to be intended to say, even if the covered cause of loss is what pushes you into the market or what changes the market, that the loss of market exclusion still applies. There's been some good case law out of this, out of the UK recently, the Orient Express case, that basically said the carriers can't do that, that if the loss is so catastrophic that it depletes the market around you, essentially the loss is worse than you would have expected, it can't be that you actually get less coverage for that because the market changed. So it'll be interesting to see how that language plays out in the United States over the next few years as we continue to have catastrophic losses like large hurricanes and large fires that can wipe out the market for months where they hit. So Chris, we've talked about what's covered. We've talked about what's not covered. What are some of the outside factors that can affect how you calculate a loss of rent?
Well, I think you've hit on one already, which is the market dynamics. So again, whenever we're analyzing and preparing a loss of rents claim or a business interruption claim, we always want to take a step back and look at the fundamentals of the coverage, which again is to put the insured in the same financial position that they would have been in but for the fire, which means you need to consider what is going on in that specific market of that operation or that building or that complex. You're also going to obviously need to take a look at historical occupancy levels of that particular property. Is this a property that has always been at around 95% occupancy, or is this one that has struggled in the years leading up to the loss and seen declining occupancies? We need to take into account the historical performance of this asset. You also touched on as well, Michael, that there are some assets that have unique characteristics. For example, student housing for college students. They have a very specific leasing cycle where we'll often see leases start on August 1st and run through July 31st, or maybe even 10-month leases through the end of May, just for a school year. Those will be treated differently than a standard apartment building, let's say in New York City. So you need to consider the specific purpose and characteristics of the asset. And then, one of the common scenarios that we often deal with as well is, are we looking at a full loss, meaning is an entire complex or building out of order? Is it offline due to the damage? Or are only a portion of the units damaged? And that can change, again, what information we'll need and how we're going to set up the loss calculation. One of the overarching themes that I will tell you, and I'll emphasize this again, is you can never have too much data. You need a lot of data to put these calculations and these claims together, and they help to substantiate and defend whatever claim, whatever calculation is presented to the carriers. Ultimately, carriers will require a certain level of detail. So again, data will be key as part of this process.
So now I want to talk about some of the challenges that come up, and we've touched on some of them as we're calculating a loss or making a claim and potentially disputing a claim. I think one of the first ones that we see carriers rely on a lot is the requirement that there's an actual loss, and that language usually is not defined in the policy. And it can sometimes give carriers an argument to say, well, you didn't suffer an actual loss. Your loss was somehow theoretical. And they can, what we see is they'll look at your projections and say, well, that projection may have been too high, or the market changed. They tie this into the loss of market argument and say, well, the market changed between the time you made the projection when you purchased the policy and what's actually occurring at the time that the loss happened, and say, you may have suffered a loss between your expectations that you have on some projection that you prepared several years ago, but in actuality, the loss is much less, or maybe even not a loss at all. So that's another area where it's important to understand the data that you have, both on the projection side and on the loss side, so that you're showing that you actually incurred a loss from what you expected. As Chris said, the difference between what you would have had the loss not occurred, based on that day, the day the loss occurred. What were your expectations, your reasonable expectations on that day compared to what actually happened going forward after following the loss? So actual loss is one thing that can be a challenge. Chris, you want to talk about tenant relocation?
Sure. And this scenario comes into play when you have a partial loss. So again, let's say you have a building that has 100 apartment units and 10 of them are damaged. Were you able to relocate some of those tenants from damaged units to vacant units that were not damaged? Oftentimes we see that the answer is yes, and you're able to shift tenants and accommodate them. Insurance companies will look at this and they may say, look, you were able to shift your tenants, there is no loss. It's usually more nuanced than that. A lot of times you lose the opportunity to rent those vacant units. You would have tried to continue to rent them had the loss not happened, but it can make it a little more complex to analyze and calculate the loss for, as opposed to a total loss where you know with absolute certainty all of your tenants are gone, you weren't able to relocate anybody. It makes it a little bit more straightforward. So that is one of the frequent challenges we see there.
Yeah, and something that can play into that that's really important is to understand how your policies are insured, if and who the insured is on that policy. You can have a very different result if your entity owns multiple apartment buildings and they're all insured under that same policy, as opposed to if you have one single purpose LLC that owns this building and they're the insured on this policy, but the other building that's owned by another single purpose LLC is insured under a separate policy. You probably have a different result there, where in the second scenario, that tenant relocation isn't going to factor in because you're talking about two distinct companies with two distinct insurance policies. There may be other reasons why you don't want to set the insurance up that way. So I'm not going to say that that's the way you should do it in all circumstances, but recognize that it could lead to a different result when you're talking about calculating your loss of rents.
That's a good point, Michael. What about sublimits? How should folks be thinking about those?
Yeah, this is a good point. Typically, loss of rents are going to be sublimited on a policy, and they're limited in two ways. The first we talked about is the period of indemnity or period of restoration. That could have an actual limit on it where it's capped at 12 months, which is what we typically see, and it probably has a deductible of 2 weeks or 21 days on some policies, even a month I've seen. So you're limited in the time period. But they also typically have a dollar limit. So there'll be a sub limit for loss of rents, and that's going to be based on a number that's usually provided by the insured during the underwriting period. And it's based on pro formas and projections that you provide to the insurer. So what's really important is that those numbers are accurate. The information that you're providing to the insured in the underwriting phase is going to have an impact on how your claim gets calculated, potentially, months or even years later. So it's important that your projections are good, that they're based on reality, they're based on the market, and they're based on what your losses actually are likely to be at any time during that policy period. Because if you have a loss that exceeds that amount, even if it's during the period of indemnity, you're only going to get coverage up to that sublimit. So very important to pay attention to how those are getting set. Chris, we started to talk a little bit about market loss and changes in the market. What about difference in markets?
Well, I think it goes hand in hand with what you were just touching on with setting sublimits and making sure you have adequate coverage. So as markets change year to year, let's say you have a building in a very hot rental market and rents are climbing 5%, 10%, 15% year after year. If you have set your limits and values for coverage years ago and the market's completely changed, you may not have enough coverage. So you should always make sure that your insurance policy reflects the current conditions of the market and the current potential of your assets, because that way you're going to avoid any sort of shortfalls in the coverage, and that can hit you significantly when you do have a claim.
And finally, Chris, you mentioned earlier about some of those extra expenses, rent concessions, leasing incentives. Where do you run into challenges with those things when you're putting together a claim?
Yeah, the challenges we see here are, it's a few things. One is you want to show the reasoning and logic and why it makes sense for you to be offering these concessions and these incentives. But on the other hand, you're kind of projecting the cost benefit. So you don't know if you spend $1,000, how much quicker you're going to be able to lease up these units had you not done that. There's a bit of a theoretical issue at play here. However, what I'll tell you is, in our experience, one of the key things is just make sure that you are communicating regularly with your insurance carrier, with their representatives, whether it's the independent adjuster and or their forensic accountants. You will want to give them plenty of notice of what your plan is. Maybe months ahead of time, you may want to let them know, hey, we are thinking of offering incentives and concessions as a way to lease up these units quicker than if we do nothing. And a lot of times, as long as they're reasonable, everybody's on the same page and there's a plan and you've communicated that plan, you'll get the buy-in from the insurance company as well. They don't want to be surprised after the fact. So after you've already gave concessions and after you've already given incentives to tenants, they don't want to just be handed a bill for that without a chance to have reviewed it ahead of time. So I would emphasize the need to communicate ahead of time with your insurance company.
Chris, this is great insight. So I really thank you for being here and spending some time with us today and sharing something about your practice and how you go about calculating these claims. That's the numbers work that we lawyers aren't always so good at and don't have the mind for. But working together, we can really tackle some of these larger claims and these tricky issues in these claims. So I want to sort of boil down what we talked about today to a few key takeaways. And I think sort of taking them in chronological order, the first thing is when you're purchasing the coverage, you want to make sure that you have good projections on what your rental values are, that they're based on the current market, they're based on what the expected market is going to be during the policy period of that policy. Because you're going to use those projections to set your limits of the whole policy, set your sublimits for the loss of rents, and also to set what's that likely restoration period. Do I need longer than a 12-month restoration period? And understanding all those things when you're purchasing the policy and how they're going to affect the claim later on. Chris, what about when you actually have a claim? What are the key takeaways that we talked about today?
Yeah, so when you have a claim, and hopefully those of you out there don't have a claim, but when you do have a claim, or if you have a claim, I would say that there's two things that I would emphasize. One, again, is data, data, data. You can never have too much data. You're going to need a lot of information and documentation to help support and substantiate your claim. So it's always good to start beginning that as soon as a loss happens, rather than waiting until the end of the process. It helps to move things forward and expedite the overall recovery. The second thing, which I just touched on when it comes to concessions, is communications. Communications are going to be key with your insurance company and their representatives. It's good to communicate often with them and making sure that everybody's expectations are aligned and everybody's aware of what is going on. Again, that in my experience has helped to move the process forward and helps to result in successful insurance recoveries after a claim has happened.
And then finally, if you have a claim and the carrier disputes it or reserves rights, it's important to analyze that carrier's position. Don't take what they're saying at face value necessarily. There are a number of issues, some of them we talked about today, that can be subject to interpretation. They can be subject to differences in language in the policy. They can be subject to new case law that's always evolving. Or they could be subject to issues with how the accountants on someone like Chris on the policyholder side and the adjusters on the carrier side are looking at the numbers. So if you have a position from a carrier, make sure you analyze it, get help when necessary, get help from some forensic accountants like Chris at Procore to look at the numbers. We at SDV look at policies and we look at denials and reservation of rights letters and pursue claims. So get help when necessary and make sure that you use both aspects, right? The legal aspect to look at the language and the facts and the circumstances and the law, as well as the accounting aspect to look at the numbers to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward for a claim. So with that, again, I'll thank Chris Mortifoglio for joining us today. If you have questions about this or any other topic, feel free to contact me. You can contact Chris. We'll post both of our emails on the screen. You can also find this video and other videos and articles at our website, sdvlaw.com, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and get more of our materials. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.